And joining us now on The Debate, in Fort Lauderdale, Florida, Daniel Pipes, Director of the Middle East Forum. In Boston, Massachusetts, Berna Turam, Professor of Sociology and International Affairs at Northeastern University. And back here in studio, Mohammed Fadl, Professor of Law at the University of Toronto. And of course, we welcome back TVO's own Foreign Affairs analyst, Janice Stein from the Munk School. Nice to have everybody. Mohammed, good to have you back on the program and our guests on the line in Points Beyond. I want to start by reading something that you are all too familiar with. This is Samuel Huntington from Foreign Affairs almost 20 years ago, in which he said, "It is my hypothesis that the fundamental source of conflict in this new world will not be primarily ideological or primarily economic. The great divisions among humankind and the dominating source of conflict will be cultural. Nation states will remain the most powerful actors in the world affairs, but the principal conflicts of global politics will occur between nations and groups of different civilizations. The clash of civilizations will dominate global politics. The fault lines between civilizations will be the battle lines of the future." Let's pick up from there. And Daniel Pipes, I'll go to you first in Florida. In thinking broadly about East-West relations, how would the past decade have been different, in your view, had 9/11 not happened?
Had 9/11 not happened, there would be less focus on terrorism and more focus on other topics, other issues, other differences.
And therefore the world would have been a better place, or just a equally confused but focusing on other things kind of a place?
Equally confused but focusing on other things. Might I make an additional comment about Mr. Huntington's article that came out nearly 20 years ago? He pointed out as proof that tensions are really across civilizations rather than nation states by noting that American tensions over economics were far more severe with Japan than with Europe. That was in the mid-90s, early 90s. Well, that was true then, but it sure hasn't been true more lately, when the real tensions have between Europe and the United States rather than Japan and the United States, where there are virtually no tensions at all. So he was writing in a moment of time, and he took the things of that moment in time and extrapolated out, and no, they're not right.
Okay. Berna Turam, as we consider East versus West on this program, how do you think the last decade would have been different had 9/11 not taken place?
Well, definitely, I agree there would be less emphasis on terror. Without denying the importance of this topic, terror or 9/11, I would also like to suggest that we have to set our concepts and terminology right, because in the last decade, we see a tendency to associate Islamists, Muslims with this term terrorist. I really strongly suggest that we have to rethink who's a terrorist, who does terror, what is a terrorist act. And I think a narrower definition is going to be helpful. With regard to Huntington, he talked about the fault lines, and each time a terrorist attack happens, we have to go back and revisit his theory. But I think we also have to remember that those fault lines are also the meeting points between different cultures, societies, and states. So my current work focuses on those fault lines, actually at a very micro level in everyday life, the divided sites like university campuses. And we can see a lot of meeting and negotiation between different groups, rather than just clash.
I appreciate that, Berna, and I'm going to infer from the earlier part of your answer that you believe states are just as capable of committing acts of terrorism as, say, stateless, non-state actors, right?
Well, when states create fault lines and start fighting, we call them war most of the time. And yes, war happens between different states, but it's not just between Muslim states and Western states. If you look at history, it happens all over the place.
Understood. Let me get Mohammed Fadl on that same first question. How would the past decade have been different?
Wow, it's so hard to imagine the last decade without 9/11 having happened. You know, whether 9/11 happened or not, I think there would have been at least a continued kind of persistent violence between Al-Qaeda and Al-Qaeda-sponsored groups in the United States, because I think there have been long-term reasons for conflict between the peoples of, I call them sort of the post-Ottoman Empire regions of the world. And
they would be who?
The Arab world,
okay.
The Arab states that succeeded to the Ottoman Empire. First Britain and France, and then the United States as a leading Western power that succeeded the role of Britain and France in the Middle East. Now, it might not have been as spectacular, right? We would have had maybe the periodic, once a year kind of car bombing of an embassy or something along that sort, and so it probably wouldn't have been the fixation on terrorism. I think the biggest difference, of course, is the domestic impact it's had on Muslim communities in the West. I mean, that's where I think the real difference would have been. I don't think there would have been nearly the kind of increase in the surveillance state that we've seen develop in Western Europe and North America.
Janice?
Yeah, I think the world would have been different because that particular act was so dramatic and so visual and so imprinted on people's minds. And that's what makes this equation possible between terrorism and Islam, which is in fact not a valid one, any more than we would say in the 70s and the 80s when there were Red Brigades that Italians were terrorists or Germans were terrorists. So I think that single act did an enormous amount of damage. It actually widened the gulf. It made it all too easy to talk about a clash of civilizations, which I don't believe exists.
You don't sign on to that?
No, I do not. I think there have always been cultural differences. That's what makes culture so interesting. There are cultural differences in this country that we could talk about. So of course, culture matters and cultures are different. But that's very far removed from the kind of angry, often violent relationship that now exists, and that's attributable in many ways.
Mohammed, a follow-up?
Yes, just a couple of quick points. I don't think we should read Samuel Huntington as declaring in a sort of deterministic fashion that there's going to be this inevitable clash of civilizations. I think he suggested that it was a reasonable possibility. However, part of the role of wise politics is to prevent it from manifesting itself. If I can make a quick point to your viewers, if we just look at the history of the 20th century, Europeans were basically responsible for the death of almost 100 million people in 2 world wars. And we can say they had a very much of a shared culture. In World War I, the King of England and the Kaiser were cousins. And that didn't stop them from doing what they did to each other.
Sure. Daniel Pipes, let me get you on this. Insofar as you believe that there is an anti-Western ideology in the Muslim world, where do you think it comes from?
The sources of radical Islam or Islamism are ultimately Islamic, but they've been affected by the currents of the 20th century. In other words, the origins of this ideology go back to the 1920s, an era when fascism and communism were first really significant. And various Muslims, such as Hassan al-Banna in Egypt and al-Maududi in India, looked at what was taking place in Italy and then Germany and Russia and said, this sort of approach with Islamic content is what will solve our problems, will make us rich and strong. So it's Islamic at base, but with a Western totalitarian ideological structure.
Berna, what would you say about that?
Well, this term Islamist, Islamic, Muslim, they're confusing because we are sometimes talking about believers, and believers exist in every religion. So I really like to switch from the terminology of Islamism to the pious. There are pious people who disagree with Western values or not, and then there are the pious in countries like Turkey or any other Muslim state, Muslim majority state, who are in power or who are in civil society. So these are all different people. This terminology of Islamist or Islamic is no longer enough to understand Muslim politics or the politics of piety in the Muslim world.
Daniel Pipes, you want to go back at that?
My topic is not the pious. One can be, for example, pious and quiescent, quietly going about one's own business. The Islamists are political. Fascism is political, communism is political, Islamism is political. Each of them has a vision of justice, of the way the world should be, and in that sense, I think pious is not the right term. Islamist is the right term.
Berna, pious people don't fly planes into buildings. Would you acknowledge there's a political angle to this as well?
Definitely. That's why I wanted to keep terrorists and terrorist acts separately from this whole politics of Islam and Muslim politics, because there are different types. In every country, there are different Islamist movements in Muslim politics. I think once we call all of them Islamists or terrorists, we are in trouble in terms of sociological or political analysis. And identifying 9/11 as a cause of politics between the West and the so-called Islam is also problematic because we miss the entire historical continuity. History doesn't start at 9/11. There has been a lot of interaction between these cultures, societies, and states before.
No, that's a fair point, and I guess for the purposes of our Countries Week here on TVO, we are focusing on the major trends or themes that have emerged in the past decade, but of course that's a kind of arbitrary starting of the clock at the beginning of the decade. But Mohammed, let me ask you to pick up on this, and Daniel Pipes' point in particular. He very much sees the beginning of the anti-Western ideology in the Muslim world starting in the 1920s with the leaders and with the isms that he described. Do you take any issue with that?
Well, I think it's certainly, first of all, I want to say, I don't claim to be an expert on the history of Egypt and the interwar period, however. To the extent of my knowledge, however, I would contest the idea that the primary motivation or the primary source of inspiration for the Muslim Brotherhood was the fascist movements of Europe. There might have been some kinds of influence in terms of the way they wanted to organize their institutions in their opposition to the Egyptian state, but more primarily their opposition to the British occupation in Egypt, which at that time was primarily in the Suez Canal. But the history of sort of Islamic revivalism, right, and its focus on political reform goes back at least a century before the Muslim Brotherhood. If you go back to the invasion, the Napoleonic invasion of Egypt, right, that really began, what served as a catalyst, right, to thinkers throughout the region to reform the politics. And part of reforming the politics was reforming the religion, the relationship of the religion to the state. For the most part, until the Muslim Brotherhood, the pious were pious and quiescent, and they could be easily sort of dominated or swayed or influenced by a class of religious scholars that were very close to the ruling class, right? And as that ruling class lost its legitimacy, religion had to respond and develop a kind of critical political theology to make religion relevant in an era of not just politicized religion, but nationalism, anti-colonialism, et cetera, in general. So I would identify anti-colonialism as much more important than fascism.
Janice, let me get you to weigh in on the pious versus the political debate we're having here.
You know, it's interesting because I agree that the relationship goes way back. It's not a 20th century relationship. You know, you had Muhammad Ali in Egypt come to power in the wake of Napoleon's invasion of Egypt. And it's a traumatic experience for Egypt. It bursts Egyptian society wide open. And yet it's led by a Muslim, but who's a profound reformer of Egyptian society. The 20th century is a struggle inside these countries. It's overlain by deep resentment of the British and French, who were the occupying powers in the Middle East, who replaced the sick man of Europe, the Ottoman Turks. But it's also a struggle within these societies. And so at the same time as the Ikhwan, the Muslim Brotherhood, is formed, you have something called liberal Democrats in Egypt, who are open to the liberal democratic experiment, who worked under the king. So to paint it all with one brush is actually to ignore the richness of the politics that have gone on in the Arab world.
Okay.
The ascendancy really of religion as a militant political movement, which we're certainly seeing in part of the Middle East now, is very recent. It's about 20 or 30 years, depending on where you want to start to count.
Having said all that, Daniel Pipes, I'm going to bring you fast forward to today. And many Westerners, I guess, like to look to Turkey, which we talked about at the beginning of the program, as an east-west bridge of sorts. What do you think that country's trajectory in the past decade tells us about East-West relations at the end of the first decade of the 21st century?
Well, that's a fascinating question. Turkey no longer claims to be a bridge between East and West. Turkey no longer is a bridge between East and West. Turkey has profoundly changed from where it was 10 years ago. In a key election that took place in November 2002, due to the oddities of Turkish electoral requirements, an Islamist party got 1/3 of the vote and 2/3 of the parliamentary seats. It's still in power. It looks to be in power for a long time to come. It has sponsored vast changes in Turkey that have led to changes in foreign policy, changes in domestic policy. I believe that Turkey is the long-term greatest threat to the West in the Middle East. Not Iran. Iran I see as being just fine once we can get through the present problems of nuclear build-up and terrorism and so forth. But the Iranians are ready to modernize. The Turks, to my astonishment, I never would have expected this a decade ago, have become the leaders of the Islamist movement and are ever more dangerous to us. So Turkey is no longer a bridge, it is now the problem.
Berna, a long-term greatest threat to peace in the Middle East. That's what Daniel Pipes said about Turkey. What's your view?
Well, it's an alternative vision of Turkey that I'm not very familiar with. And usually my fieldwork reveals different evidence. Most of the Islamic groups, including the Islamic government, and I will use the term Islamic if you insist, doesn't look anti-Western to most of us. Actually, they have engaged Western cultures and societies, and they have shaken hands with them. The paradox that comes from my work is that the hardcore secularists, the followers of Atatürk, Mustafa Kemal Atatürk, have actually been frustrated by their previous Western allies. They feel betrayed by their Western allies because the West has been actually more supportive of the political reform conducted by the Islamic JDP, Justice and Development Party, especially in the first 3 years of their rule, but also for the constitutional reform, which happened very recently. So I'm actually a little bit appalled by this interpretation.
Just a little bit appalled?
I'm not familiar. So yeah, there is a disagreement in the literature and politics, but the government itself, which consists of pious people, is not very unusual even in the U.S. The pious in the U.S. come to power and they're not called, seen as a threat to the secular regime. So I don't see why we have to read Turkey differently than we read the pious in power or politics in the United States or the Christian Democrat parties in Europe.
I'm not sure a liberal Democrat in the United States would share your view about religious people in the American government not being a threat to their understanding of the way the U.S. government's supposed to work. But putting that aside, we do have people here in the studio who can't wait to get into this as well on this issue of whether Turkey is the long-term greatest threat to peace in the Middle East. Mohammed.
Well, I think the statement is astounding, right? But it's quite, I think, consistent with the long-term problems that we have in the region.
What's astounding about the statement?
Astounding is because the Justice and Development Party, as my colleague just mentioned, they are responsible for the most far-reaching democratic reforms in the history of Republican Turkey.
But
right?
he's saying in the long term, Daniel's saying they're going in the wrong direction.
No, they're going in the wrong direction solely if the only thing you're concerned about is of Turkey being an instrument for U.S. foreign policy. Right? And this is the basic problem. We have right now a contradiction between our aims of democratization and our security aims. Our security aims, I'm speaking now as an American, we assume are furthered when we have compliant governments. Democracies are not compliant. Democracies are independent and their independence has to be respected. This is the biggest dilemma right now facing American policy. Do we promote democracy and take the risk of having to deal with the states in this region as equal partners? Or do we continue supporting authoritarian governments that we can dominate and control, right? And this is the source of the conflict. Not Islam, not Christianity, not liberalism, right? Is America willing to treat the states in the region as independent and deal with them on that basis?
You know, let's just look at the record of Erdogan since he came to power. One,
the Turkish leader.
The Turkish leader. One, as I said, as part of this dialogue with the EU, undertakes actually a sweeping set of reforms in Turkey. Two, subjects himself and his government to the rule of the court, even when he doesn't like the ruling. Three, attempts to change the judges, which somebody with a no less impeccable than FDR himself did in the United States. Four, he works very hard to keep the military out of politics. Now, if you just change the name of the party that was doing this, you would actually look at this and say, that's a pretty impressive record for a Democratic Party. It just happens to be a party of the pious as well. So we need to keep our eye focused on what this government has actually done domestically.
Daniel Pipes, I suspected you were going to have a tough time getting a seconder for that notion that the long-term greatest threat to peace in the Middle East was Turkey, but do you want to take another shot at it?
Well, I request that we return to the subject in 10 years, and we'll see who's right and who's wrong. I mean, a lot of detail. Sure, fine. But in fact, what we have is an Islamist leadership that is taking its country cleverly, but quickly, in the direction of radical Islam. We can go through all the details of Turkish affiliation to Iran, Turkey's moving away from the West, Turkey's working closely with Syria. It's becoming part of what's called the Muqawama bloc, the resistance bloc headed by Iran. Domestically, it's not just a matter of pious, it's a matter of implementing Islamic law, whether it be in the area of marriage or alcohol consumption or many other areas of life. This is plain and clearly an Islamist government that's moving in the direction of radical Islam. I don't know how one can be blind to that, but I guess some people can be.
Okay, Bernie, your turn.
I'm not familiar with any move towards Sharia. At the level of the state, the changes that JDP has conducted has not moved towards Sharia or Islamic law. Actually, Turkey is the only country which does not have any effect of Sharia law, even in the civil code, that arranges marriage, divorce, inheritance, etc. This has not changed a bit. The changes, reform has been in different areas. And I'm not going to argue that there hasn't been a lot of conflict, disagreement, and negotiation, but it doesn't take place at the level of the state. Most of the time, the negotiations, or if you would like, I'll call it contestation, takes place at the level of the street. In the neighborhoods, for example, people are negotiating space and place, how they're going to share beaches and clubs and restaurants. Yes, there has been debates about alcohol, but it's not forbidden in Turkey. You can drink alcohol in most of the restaurants. Some of them don't serve it, and then there is discontent. But the fight is on the street, not at the state level. There has been political reform at the state level, which has nothing to do with Sharia. And actually, I can share some of my data with you, not here, but later maybe. The so-called Islamists in Turkey, the pious in power in civil society, are not, have never been defending Sharia law. They wanted to make more space for faith-based lives under a secular state. And you can ask every and each of them if you conduct ethnography and fieldwork in Turkey. They're not going to lie about this.
Okay, let's see if I can broaden the discussion here from Turkey in particular, which we've been talking about for the last several moments, to the state of Islam in general. And I want to do that by comparing two significant leaders in its history. Ataturk, of course, from Turkey, said religion has no place in politics. Ayatollah Khomeini from Iran said religion cannot be separated from politics. What does the difference between these two Muslim leaders, Mohammed, let me go to you first on this. What does the difference between these two Muslim leaders tell us about the state of Islam in the world today?
Well, I don't think you can make a diagnosis of the state of Islam in the world today. I mean, I don't mean to sort of not answer your question, but there are 1.5 billion Muslims. I think the Organization of Islamic Conference has at least 50 member states, maybe even more. A third of Muslims in the world live as minorities in non-Muslim countries. I think you have a range of politics in various different Muslim states. You have Turkey, you have Indonesia. The number of Muslims in Indonesia is almost the same as all of the Muslims in the Arab world. The politics in Indonesia obviously is very different than the politics of Islam in the Arab world, and you can't even generalize about the Arab world, right?
So there's no direction.
I don't think there's a direction that you can apply to all areas of the Muslim world. I think you need to be very, very specific in which regions we're talking about. And I think at the end of the day, politics always is the controlling factor. In a state of conflict, right? I think it's fair to say oftentimes Muslims will rally around to the language that Islam provides, right? Outside of a state of conflict, you can have a very different kind of language arise.
Janice.
Yeah, you know, I agree partly, but not entirely. I agree that there's tremendous diversity within Islam, and that's why I don't like the Huntington formulation, because it misses and washes out all that diversity.
And we didn't even mention, what, 250 million Muslims in India, who are a minority in India.
I alluded to them by saying that.
Yeah. That's right. Yeah. I mean, the Indian Muslim community is larger than Indonesia, which is the largest Muslim state, and the diversity is so rich. However, it's also fair to say that there is a strain of militant Islam which has grown in the last 20, 30 years, which actually crosses those borders. So you have militant movements in Indonesia, where one wouldn't really expect to find them. We have militant movements in the Arab world. We certainly have militant movements in Iran. We have militant movements among some Muslims living in the West. And so it's not by coincidence. We can get into a heated debate about why that's happening, but nevertheless, there is a strain of militancy in Islam across the Muslim world today, despite, and there's small numbers in many countries, but despite this huge diversity and difference that we've talked about. And it's that which bears attention and you know, some focus.
Daniel Pipes, you want to come in on that?
Yeah, I'd like to confirm Janice's point, but before I do, point of fact, there are more Muslims in Indonesia than in India. There are more in South Asia than in Indonesia, but Indonesia has the largest number of Muslims of any country. I'd like to agree and say that, perhaps put it more pungently, and say that throughout the world, everywhere, with the single exception of Iran, radical Islam, that is to say the attempt to apply the Sharia, Islamic law, in its totality, radical Islam is on the ascent. Iran is the exception. Iran is striking. Iran is the place to watch. Iran is the place of the future, where Muslims begin to move away from this extremism.
Radical Islam, Berna, on the ascent. You agree with that?
Now, just to break it for 1 second before.
Hang on. Yeah. We got to go in order here. Go ahead, Berna.
Well, in general, we can observe the rise of radicalism in Islamic movements. But I really believe the so-called fault line that Turkey constitutes did not really accommodate or produce much radical Islam. I don't like to use the term moderate because it's been overused, but most of the pious people in politics or in civil society in Turkey are not really advocates of Sharia or an Islamic state, and they have been actually engaging Western countries and Central Asian, Turkic Muslim countries more often than countries ruled by Sharia rule.
Yeah,
okay,
the comment
Janice?
I just quickly want to make before Mohammed is how we define radical really matters. To me, radical Islam is not defined by the attempt to use Sharia as a legal structure, because there are many different societies that use religious law in one way or the other to structure parts of public life. To me, radical Islam is characterized by a willingness to use force to achieve political objectives.
Terrorism.
Well, more than terrorism, but it's a willingness to use force to achieve political objectives. And it's that strain that we're seeing in ways that we did not see, for instance, 50 years ago.
Hang on, Mohammed. Daniel Pipes, then Mohammed.
Yeah, two-hander. No, I strenuously disagree. To limit Islamism, radical Islam, fundamentalist Islam, political Islam, whatever you want to call it, to the use of force is really to misunderstand it. Force is a tactic, and yeah, it's one important tactic, but there's another tactic, which is working through the system, the media, the educational institutions, the political institutions, the legal institutions. It's just as important. And so what you have, for example, is the takeover of the state in Iran or Afghanistan or in Sudan through force, and that's one way of getting there, but then you have another way, such as in Turkey, through the electoral blocks. And I think the latter way, what I call Islamism 2.0, is far more effective than Islamism 1.0, which is using force. I think you're missing the real future of the story if you just limit it to the use of force.
I should give Janice a chance to come back at that, and then Mohammed, I promise I'll get to you.
Quickly, I don't agree because I think what you're calling Islam 2.0, which is coming to power through democratic processes, is precisely what you want. When I look at what the government in Turkey has done since it came to power through democratic processes, it actually, on its domestic behavior, has not behaved at all like a radical or militant regime. And I would argue the relationship goes the other way, that when governments are elected, Islamic governments are elected through democratic processes, they reach out, and they reach out to other constituencies and other communities that live inside their borders.
Hamas a good example of that?
No, Hamas didn't, but Hamas really did not come to power in the same way. There was a democratic election, but then the radical break that took place in Gaza exacerbated that problem. So in some sense, I think it's exactly the reverse, but that's what you want to see, is governments coming to power.
Okay, Mohammed.
I really have to agree with Janice here. I mean, I would look and say that across the Muslim world, radical Islamism is beating a hasty retreat everywhere you look. What you see are Islamic movements becoming much more moderate, much more willing to accept pluralism, much more willing to accept basic democratic freedoms. Now, to the extent that allows them to institutionalize themselves in civil society and exist as peaceful members of civil society, I think that's a great thing. right? And that's quite a positive thing, right? That allows for the entrenchment of democratic institutions in society. What we can't have is a permanent situation where we have authoritarianism throughout the Muslim world justified in the language that Daniel is suggesting, because he's essentially what he's saying is as soon as you allow for civil society to open up and Islamic-inspired groups to compete, then they're going to entrench themselves into society. We're going to have a disaster. That's what he calls Islamism 2.0. He calls it a disaster, right? When all they're doing is just exercising the rights of the civil rights that we take for granted. I think Janice is right. This is a good thing.
Daniel, I should give you a chance to come back at that if you want to.
It was a good thing to have the fascists work, the Nazis work through the political system in Germany and have Hitler to come to power legitimately. No. Non-democratic forces are evil, do harm, and just because they come to power through democracy doesn't make them any better. Steve pointed out Hamas, I'm pointing out Hitler. This is and you know, in the case of Turkey, it was the leader of the AKP, of the political party now in charge, Recep Tayyip Erdogan, who said that democracy is like a street bus. You get off it when you've arrived at your destination, making it very clear that he's only going to be democratic insofar as it helps him.
But he hasn't gotten off it.
Not Democrats.
But he
These
hasn't
are not
gotten
people. No, he hasn't got off it yet. No. Give him I said, let's look at this again in 10 years.
Okay.
No, but this is not a process we want to encourage. We do not want to have Democrats exploiting the democratic system.
See, I mean, I think that's the real contradiction. Look what happened in Egypt in the last month. Obviously fraudulent parliamentary elections that have forced Egyptians out into the street to demonstrate because they have no way of expressing any political voice. An authoritarian regime.
No access to mass media.
No access to mass media. You know, fundamentally, this time they did not allow anybody who self-described as an Islamist or Islamic party to run. So they're wiped off the political map. You have a repressive regime which actually drives the politics toward extremism.
Okay, let me jump in here because we got about 6 minutes to go and I want to read something. I don't know how many of you saw this. Front page New York Times today. Really fascinating story on something going on in Saudi Arabia, and I'll read a short extract from that. With more than 13 million Saudis, half the population under 20, the 86-year-old Saudi ruler, King Abdullah, is trying to create more than 1 million new jobs and 4 million homes within 10 to 15 years. He and his royal clan envision an economy less dependent on oil, run by a new class of doctors, engineers, and businessmen who can function in a global marketplace. To accomplish this feat, the Saudi government says it needs to crack the door open to some sort of Western-style modernity, or at least a softer version of the Islam practiced here, with its strictly enforced separation of the sexes, its severe restrictions on the public lives of women, and the ever-watchful eye of the religious police. The idea is to create islands from which change would seep out, drop by drop, without antagonizing powerful conservative forces within the country. If the plan works, at best it would transform Saudi Arabia into a technologically advanced society controlled by a slightly more tolerant religious autocracy. Or it could provoke militant violence and government crackdowns. Berna, I guess question to you first is, are the Saudis playing with fire here?
It's a good question. I think they are undertaking a very difficult experiment, but comparatively speaking, they're using space to create new spaces where they can engage Western powers and cultures. And many countries do these kind of experiments without calling it, specifically like the Saudi highlight. That's why I think space becomes a very important medium to negotiate power. I call it spatiality of power. That's why we see the issue of burqa and how women can present themselves on the beach and how men and women are going to share beaches and restaurants. So here we see a whole new planning of how to have urban politics and urban life by redefining spaces without segregating them. Because you can easily fall into the trap of segregating space and creating isolated spaces for the pious or the Islamists and the secular people. And we don't want segregated cities. And Istanbul right now is actually negotiating in very interesting ways space, how to share this city that has been actually shared by many cultures and civilizations for such a long time. So Saudi experiment is interesting in the sense that Saudi Arabia changes much slower than the dynamic Turkey changes, but it's not an unusual experiment. I don't think they're playing with fire. They're undertaking a very difficult experiment.
Mohammed, more risky to do this or not to do this?
You know, I don't know about risk. I'm not very optimistic, though. I don't think that the basic problem in Saudi Arabia, I mean, gender is a problem, but I think the biggest problem in Saudi Arabia is the distinction between Saudi and non-Saudi. There are too many privileges that one gets for being a Saudi. I think their biggest problem is because of the radical disjuncture and privilege between being Saudi and non-Saudi, there's insufficient incentive for Saudis to develop their own human capital. And this goes back to the lack of democracy. The ruling dynasty does not want democracy, right? Because they're the ultimate beneficiaries of this system of privilege, right? But you can't, it's very hard to encourage people to invest in their own talents when you don't have a democratic regime, right?
Janice.
You know, the story that you, of these Saudi cities is absolutely fascinating, because where are these Saudi cities, these satellite cities being built? Outside and away from Riyadh. So Berna's point, they are segregated. It's quite remarkable. And there are more liberal practices are allowed inside these cities, but not outside these cities. And there was apparently an incident where some of it appeared on the functional equivalent of YouTube through video of men and women dancing together, which provoked a violent reaction from what is fundamentally a Wahhabist Islamic leadership, which shut the experiment down. The core problem, frankly, is in the nature of Islam in Saudi Arabia, which is deeply intolerant, which discriminates against women, and which the royal family has tried to moderate in fits and starts with no success. And from my perspective, it's an explosion waiting to happen.
Daniel Pipes, what's your view of it?
I think a point of correction is that those YouTube videos did not get it closed down. It meant that they were much more cautious about it. No, this experiment is underway, and I think it's an important one, and I say bravo to the Saudi leadership, and particularly the King Abdullah. I see it as an important move in the right direction, dangerous to be sure, but important. Let me conclude my vision by saying I think there are two states in the Muslim world that are most important and going in the right direction, and that's Iran in a deep fashion and Saudi Arabia in a superficial fashion. And two states that are most worrisome, one is Turkey and the other is Pakistan. And these are the four states that I think viewers should keep their eyes on. These are the ones that will determine much of what happens in the Muslim world.
Janice, you want a quick comeback on that?
Yeah, I think Daniel's absolutely right that these are the four important states, and I agree with him on Pakistan. I do not agree with him on Turkey, and I actually don't agree on Saudi Arabia.
How about Iran? Is Iran going in the right direction?
Iran, it is the most conflicted society, and I agree there that if you actually move outside the ruling elites, there is a lot of opposition to the way Islamic law has been interpreted and enforced in that society. There's no question.
Okay, that's got to be the last word today. Can I thank all of our guests for participating in tonight's discussion? Daniel Pipes from the Middle East Forum in our studio in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. Berna Turam from Northeastern University, who was on the line from Boston. Thank you so much to both of you for being there on the line. And our University of Toronto grouping here in the capital city of Ontario. Mohammed Fadl from the Faculty of Law, Janice Stein from the Munk School of Global Affairs. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Steve.